Imagine the mighty Roman army, invincible, feared by all until, in a dark and treacherous forest, it was utterly annihilated in a humiliating defeat. How did this happen? How did such a grand empire fall into a trap that altered the course of history? In today's video, we're diving into one of Rome's most disastrous moments, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. A fatal mistake, a shocking betrayal, and consequences that echoed for centuries. Stay until the end, because this story is full of unbelievable twists. In the fall of 9 AD, the vastness of the forests of Germania would become the stage for an event that would shake even the deepest foundations of the Roman Empire. 3 Roman legions, a true military force composed of over 20,000 well-trained men, marched confidently through the unknown territory, as if they were unstoppable. Together, they formed the backbone of the empire, accompanied by auxiliary units and a massive supply column. For the Romans, this was just another pacification mission, a simple step in their quest to extend their dominion over the vast land of Germania, which they believed was a natural extension of their expanding empire. Commanding them was Publius Quinctilius Varus, a seasoned governor who, although efficient in administering pacified provinces like Syria, had little knowledge of the wild, untamed nature of Germania. He viewed the situation with optimism, convinced that Roman superiority in discipline and the strength of its legions would secure yet another victory. However, Varus and his forces were completely unaware of the plot unfolding around them. The hostile terrain of the forests, a completely different environment from Roman conquests in Gaul or Egypt, was shrouded in a curtain of mist and shadows. Among the trees, a coalition of Germanic tribes, united under a traitorous leader, was preparing for the most decisive ambush in the history of ancient Rome. Arminius, a man with Germanic roots and Roman experience, had orchestrated the betrayal that would lead the Roman legions to their ruin. General Varus, in his blind confidence, had no idea he was being lured into a fatal trap. The legions marched, thinking they were simply crossing yet another unexplored land, unaware that their fate had already been sealed in the density of the trees and the treacherous swamps of Germania. The smell of the damp, cold earth, mixed with the growing tension in the air, signaled that something was about to change forever. The Battle of Teutoburg would not just be a military defeat, but the beginning of a chapter of humiliation and reflection that would haunt Rome for generations. The Roman Empire, until then seen as invincible, could never have imagined that a small coalition of Germanic tribes, knowledgeable of the terrain and led by a man who had been trained at the heart of the empire itself, would be capable of challenging the Roman war machine so decisively. The confidence of the Romans would turn to despair, and the shadow of defeat would begin to stretch over the legions, like an impenetrable cloud, leading them into a merciless confrontation that would forever change the course of history. Before the Battle of Teutoburg, the Roman Empire took pride in its reputation as the most formidable military force in the world. From the conquest of Gaul to the subjugation of Egypt, Rome seemed invincible, capable of crushing any resistance that opposed it. Its legions, well-trained and equipped, advanced fearlessly, conquering vast territories, building roads, forts, and establishing a network of dominion that stretched from the Atlantic to Egypt, from North Africa to the British Isles. The Roman Empire was not just a territorial empire but a war machine, a force so impressive that its enemies, upon witnessing the discipline of the legions, often preferred to surrender without a fight. The Roman legions, known for their unbeatable formation, were composed of highly trained soldiers, experts in combat tactics, who stood out for their ability to form rigid, well-coordinated lines, capable of facing any army, even one superior in numbers. Their weapons, with deadly precision and lethal efficiency, were symbols of Roman power. When a Roman legion marched, it carried with it not just men and equipment, but the weight of centuries of military tradition and confidence in its unbeatable strength. Roman discipline was legendary. Every soldier followed orders with precision, every movement was calculated, and the Romans, aware of their invincibility, believed that their willpower and organization could overcome any adversity. Nothing seemed capable of halting Rome's advance, not even the barbarian tribes of the north or the merciless deserts of Egypt. However, what the Romans didn't know was that their greatest weakness wasn't in their military strength, but in their presumption that their power would be enough to subjugate any people, without considering the complexities of the territories they were trying to conquer. The wild and hostile nature of Germania, with its dense forests, treacherous swamps, and rugged terrain, posed a completely different challenge from anything the Romans had encountered so far. The power of the Roman military machine dissolved in the face of an enemy who understood the land better than anyone. Moreover, the Germanic tribes, led by figures like Arminius, were willing to use unconventional tactics to fight against a military force they knew they couldn't defeat in open combat. This is what made Teutoburg so terrifying. The demonstration that Rome, which seemed unbeatable, could be defeated not by superior force, but by a strategically smarter force, one that knew how to use its weaknesses against it. Roman invincibility was brutally and decisively challenged in that forest, where the confidence of the Romans was transformed into a nightmare. The lesson left for Rome, and for the world, was clear. Even the most powerful empires can be defeated, not only by brute force, but by cunning, knowledge, and the ability to exploit what the enemy considers safe and invulnerable. The idea that Rome would be able to conquer and subjugate any land was deeply shaken. The Battle of Teutoburg, more than just a defeat, was a mortal blow to the myth of Roman invincibility. Germania, with its vast and inhospitable territory, seemed a distant challenge for the Romans, who were accustomed to fighting in open fields or on the borders of great, organized civilizations. The land they now sought to conquer was a wild region, dominated by dense forests, treacherous swamps, and irregular hills, where Roman order seemed out of place. Unlike the vast cities Rome conquered, Germania was a land of decentralized, nomadic tribes whose ways of life were shaped by the untamed nature around them. There, survival depended more on knowledge of the land than on the power of an organized army. The climate of Germania, damp and cold, made the Roman march even more difficult. Frequent rains and muddy ground made the paths treacherous, and the legion's maneuvers became a challenge. The heavy Roman armor and equipment, designed for open-field combat, became a burden in the region's harsh conditions. The dense forests, with their tall trees and thick foliage, limited visibility and made it difficult for the Romans to form their traditional battle lines, which relied on rigid, coordinated formations. The trees, instead of providing shelter, became a deadly trap, allowing enemies to hide and move unseen. This wild terrain was the perfect setting for the Germanic tribes, who knew the region like no one else. The local tribes were masters of navigating these forests and used the rugged terrain to their advantage. While the Romans were forced to advance slowly, cautiously, the Germanic warriors could move swiftly, in small groups, taking advantage of every feature of the land to ambush the invaders. Natural traps, like the swamps and marshy areas, became insurmountable obstacles for the heavy legions, who could barely move efficiently in the adverse conditions. The deep knowledge the Germanic tribes had of the terrain was key to the success of their resistance. They knew exactly where to strike, how to escape without leaving a trace, and how to use the forest to hide while preparing to launch quick, deadly attacks. Rome, on the other hand, was used to fighting wars in more controlled environments, where the army could maneuver freely, rely on their fortifications, and maintain control of the situation. In Germania, this was impossible. The terrain became a prison for the Romans, where every step could be their last. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest was marked not only by direct confrontation, but also by the way geography and climate worked in favor of the Germans. The dense forest, uneven terrain, and natural obstacles became powerful allies for the resistance, turning the Roman army's apparent invincibility into a fatal vulnerability. Nature, with its relentless and unpredictable force, became the great defender of the freedom of the Germanic tribes, leaving the Roman legions at the mercy of an impending defeat. Publius Quinctilius Varus was a man of great administrative experience, but his military skills left much to be desired when it came to a scenario like that of Germania. Born into a family with a long Roman tradition, Varus had already commanded Roman forces in other regions, but his career as a governor was more marked by his ability to manage and organize than by his victories on the battlefield. He had governed provinces such as Syria, where his strict and authoritarian approach worked well, maintaining order and increasing revenue through heavy taxes. However, this same inflexible mindset was not prepared for the unique challenges of Germania. His main failure was not understanding the nature of the Germanic tribes and the complexities of their social and political relations. Rome was known for its ability to pacify peoples through military force and the imposition of laws and taxes, but Germania was not a land of organized cities or people subjected to central power. It was a land of scattered tribes, with local leaders and a social structure different from what Varus was used to. To him, the Germanic tribes were a savage people who should submit to Roman order. But he did not realize that the pride and independence of the Germanic tribes were stronger than the mere imposition of authority. Varus made another crucial mistake by blindly trusting Arminius, a Germanic auxiliary commander who had been useful on some occasions, but who, behind the scenes, was plotting the greatest betrayal in Roman history. Arminius, with his ability to manipulate Varus's trust, knew that the Roman general would rely on him and follow his guidance without question. Varus, in his overconfidence, ignored warnings from other Germanic leaders, such as Segestes, who tried to warn him of the imminent betrayal. He believed that Arminius, a man educated in Rome and who had fought alongside the Romans, was a loyal ally. This trust proved fatal. In making crucial decisions, Varus failed to properly assess the risks of the terrain or the tactics of the Germans. When Arminius suggested a march into the interior of Germania, claiming that a rebel threat needed to be suppressed, Varus did not hesitate. He decided to advance, trusting his guide, unaware that he was walking into a carefully laid trap. This misjudgment was not just that of a commander, but of a man who allowed himself to be blinded by his confidence in his own abilities and the belief that Rome could subjugate any people, anywhere. When the battle began, Varus realized too late that he had been deceived. The ambush he thought was just a simple suppression mission turned into a nightmare, with his legions unprepared and disorganized, being overwhelmed by the ferocity of the Germans and the relentless nature of the terrain. Desperate, Varus tried to reorganize his forces, but the confusion, loss of control, and lack of options made defeat inevitable. In the end, Varus's own life, in a desperate gesture of shame and honor, was extinguished by suicide. The Roman Empire lost not only a commander, but also a great opportunity to expand its dominance beyond the Rhine. Varus's failure to understand the enemy and the terrain would be remembered for generations as a bitter lesson about the limits of trust and the arrogance of an empire that thought itself invincible. Arminius, a name that still echoes through the pages of history as the greatest traitor in ancient Rome, had a background that reflected his ability to maneuver between two worlds. Born among the Cherusei, a Germanic tribe, Arminius was taken to Rome as a young man, as part of the Roman custom of taking hostages from conquered peoples to ensure the loyalty of the tribes. This time in Rome was crucial for his development. There, he received an impeccable military education, was trained in the Roman army, and rose through the ranks to a position of trust. Arminius, despite his Germanic origins, obtained Roman citizenship and was treated as a true Roman, even participating in campaigns on behalf of Rome. The young German had become a notable figure within Caesar's army. When he returned to his homeland, Arminius had an unusual status. He was now a commander of the Germanic auxiliary troops serving the Roman Empire. He held a unique strategic position, a bridge between Rome and the Germanic peoples. However, Arminius's loyalty was not with Rome. Although he was integrated into the Roman system, his heart and soul belonged to his people. When looking at the land of the Germans, Arminius knew that resistance to Roman domination was his true mission, but the moment to act had not yet come. As tensions in Germania began to rise, Arminius started to cultivate an audacious plan. He knew that while the Roman legions were formidable in open battle, they were vulnerable in rugged terrain, such as the dense forests and swamps of Germania. He used his position of trust with the Romans to deceive General Varus, convincing him that a march into the interior of Germania would be necessary to suppress a rebellion from local tribes. Arminius knew that this journey would lead Varus straight into the heart of his trap. With impressive cunning, he manipulated the Roman general, suggesting a solution that seemed logical, but which he knew would be fatal. During the march, Arminius used his deep knowledge of the terrain and the Germanic war tactics to lure the Romans into an ambush, where the rough terrain and dense forests would cause their battle formations to disintegrate. While Rome relied on the strength of its legions, Arminius knew that the true strength lay in surprise, speed, and the brutality of the attack. He orchestrated the assault in perfect harmony with the nature around him, and when the battle began, it was as if the very land of Germania rose up against the invaders. But Arminius's betrayal was not only military. His personal journey of loyalty and disillusionment with Rome led him to make a decision that would change the fate of his land and his people. Arminius was undoubtedly a man divided. He loved his homeland, but he also knew the power of Rome and its expansionist ambitions. His betrayal was not driven by hatred alone, but by a broader vision of the struggle for his people's freedom. What began as an act of betrayal, according to the Romans, was seen by the Germans as an act of resistance, an opportunity to rid themselves of the shadow of the Roman Empire. Alongside his people, Arminius saw what seemed to be the first true victory against Rome, a defeat that would shake the empire's confidence and forever change its course of expansion. However, even with the victory over Rome, Arminius could not escape internal dilemmas. While he was hailed as a hero by the Germanic tribes, his power and ambitions began to generate resentment among his own allies. The leader who had defeated Rome now faced a different battle, a battle within for his position of power. Rome had always believed in its ability to subdue any territory it crossed. The empire, with its disciplined army, impeccable roads, and advanced infrastructure, had a well-defined approach to conquest: control, pacify, and transform. But Germania was a land that defied any traditional method. The Germanic tribes were decentralized and highly independent, with a lifestyle in tune with the wild nature around them. To Rome, that distant territory seemed just another challenge to be overcome. However, what the Romans did not fully understand was that the rules that had worked in Gaul or Egypt did not apply there. Rome's plan for Germania reflected its conquest strategy in other regions, which was based on the construction of fortresses, establishment of garrisons, and above all, the building of roads to facilitate the movement of legions. Rome believed that by creating a network of military bases and imposing taxes and laws, it would make the Germanic tribes submit to its control. It was an integration approach, turning the wild land into an extension of the empire. However, the difficulties were many. First, the geography of Germania posed a massive obstacle. The region was covered with dense forests and treacherous swamps, making any swift or effective troop movement difficult. Roman roads, designed for smoother terrain, were ineffective in the complicated conditions of Germania's forests and mountains. Furthermore, Rome failed to understand the true nature of the Germanic tribes. They were not urban or sedentary peoples who would easily submit to taxes or the authority of distant rulers. On the contrary, the Germanic tribes were largely nomadic, with a culture of fierce resistance to external domination. Rome's conquest model, which worked well in more organized lands with a strong city presence, failed miserably in Germania. The concept of pacifying a region through the imposition of a centralized government that required taxes and obedience did not have the desired effect. In fact, it was precisely this attempt at domination that fueled the growing local resistance. The tribes began to unite, not to collaborate with Rome, but to fight against it. Each attempt to establish a new fortress or road was seen as another threat, an intrusion into their sacred lands and ways of life. Rome also underestimated the Germanic tribes' ability to organize effectively. Though they lacked the bureaucratic apparatus or military strength of an empire like Rome, the Germanic tribes were highly adaptable, familiar with the terrain, and capable of forming temporary alliances to face a common enemy. Unlike the rigid and disciplined Roman legions, the Germanic tribes used flexible tactics, moving quickly through the terrain and using surprise as their primary weapon. These miscalculations were crucial to Rome's failure in Germania. The initial invasion and attempts to subjugate not only failed to consolidate Roman power, but created fierce resistance that would challenge the empire for years. Rome's history, one of resounding victories, began to show signs of weakness in a territory where the Romans could not apply their traditional methods of conquest. Germania proved to be an insurmountable obstacle, and Rome began to realize that not every territory could be conquered by force. Arminius, with his deep understanding of the Roman army and the Germanic terrain, began to devise a plan that would change the course of history. He knew that the Roman legions were formidable in open combat, with their unbeatable battle formations and unquestionable discipline. However, he also knew that this strength depended on favorable terrain, where troops could organize and fight in a coordinated manner. In contrast, the dense forests and treacherous swamps of Germania offered a strategic advantage he knew how to exploit. The great secret of Arminius' plan lay in his ability to manipulate both the Romans and the Germanic tribes. He used his position as commander of the Germanic auxiliary troops to gain the trust of Varro, the Roman commander, and make him believe that he was a loyal ally. Arminius was astute enough to understand that Rome was prone to an aggressive approach, and that Emperor Varro, with his great confidence in the Roman legions, would not hesitate to launch a major expedition to pacify Germania further. It was then that he set his trap, convincing Varro that an incursion into the interior of Germania was necessary to deal with a rebellion threat among the local tribes. The plan seemed perfect to the Romans. Varro, unsuspecting, fully trusted Arminius and believed that his march into the interior of Germania would be an opportunity to strengthen Roman presence in the region. Arminius, on the other hand, knew he was leading the Romans into a meticulously planned ambush, a fatal blow to Roman confidence in Germanic territory. He used his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage, carefully planning the places where the Roman legions would be most vulnerable. Arminius knew that the Roman battle strategy was based on rigid, cohesive lines, and that this formation would be useless in the irregular, densely covered terrain of the Germanic forests. He also knew that the Roman legions, with their large number of men and resources, were slow and vulnerable to surprise attacks. Arminius organized an army of warriors from the Germanic tribes, spreading them in strategic points along the expedition's route, waiting for the right moment to strike. He knew that by launching the attack at the moment of total surprise, he would have a decisive advantage. The ambush would take place at the ideal location, a region with many trees and swamps, where the Romans would lose their formation and military effectiveness. Arminius knew that with a combination of his leadership and favorable terrain, he could disrupt the Roman legions and defeat them, even with their superior numbers. He also had the advantage of knowing the weaknesses of the Roman army, their excessive reliance on discipline, the rigidity of their formations, and their unfamiliarity with the complexity of the Germanic terrain. In plotting this strategy, Arminius was not just seeking the defeat of a legion. He knew he was creating an opportunity to deliver a psychological blow to the Roman Empire, a defeat that would leave an indelible mark on history and challenge Rome's view of itself as an invincible empire. For Arminius, the battle was not just a military fight, but an issue of liberation and identity. He envisioned a future where the Germanics would no longer be forced to submit to Roman domination. This brilliant strategy of Arminius was not just a demonstration of military skill, but also of a deep understanding of Roman psychology and the weaknesses of their empire. He knew that the key to success was breaking Rome's confidence, showing that even the most powerful force in the world was vulnerable to an enemy who knew its terrain and its own limitations. Publius Quinctilius Varus was a man of great prestige within the Roman Empire, with a career marked by his ability to govern pacified provinces. His success in Syria, where he implemented efficient administration and collected heavy taxes, earned him a reputation as a strict and effective ruler. This experience led him to be appointed governor of Germania, a mission that seemed more like an administrative formality than a great military challenge. Rome believed that, after its victories in other regions, Germania would be just another province to be subdued. Varro, trusting his own experience, saw no reason to doubt this view. His confidence in himself and the information he received blinded him to the complexity of the situation in Germania. He was unprepared to deal with the peculiarities of local resistance, nor did he have a deep understanding of the tactics of the Germanic tribes. Arminius, his commander of Germanic auxiliary troops, was a key piece in this game of deception. Varro, in his position of authority and prestige, saw Arminius as a valuable ally, a man who knew the Germanics and could guide him safely through hostile lands. Arminius had become a trusted officer, and Varro did not question his suggestions. It was this blind trust that led him to make fatal decisions. When Arminius suggested that an incursion into the interior of Germania was necessary to deal with an impending revolt, Varus didn't hesitate. He believed that Arminius, with his experience and knowledge of the land, had a clear strategic vision. Ignoring warning signs, such as the evasive behavior of some Germanic tribes and the warning from Segestes, a Germanic leader at odds with Arminius, Varus pressed forward without hesitation. This trust in Arminius reflected the Roman imperial mindset, a deep-seated belief that Rome, with its military strength and allies, could subjugate any threat. For Varus, the fact that Arminius was a Roman citizen who had distinguished himself in the military hierarchy was enough to guarantee his loyalty. This belief became a trap. Varus ignored Segestes' advice, warning of Arminius' potential betrayal, convinced that a man trained in the Roman ranks would never conspire against the empire. This misjudgment became even clearer when Varus found himself advancing through treacherous terrain, unaware that he was walking directly into the center of a trap that Arminius had meticulously planned. Varus' confidence, fueled by his past successes, had disarmed his ability to perceive the risks and threats approaching. He didn't realize he was dealing with an enemy who knew exactly how to exploit Rome's weaknesses, using geography and terrain to his advantage. When the ambush was finally sprung, Varus, who trusted his commander completely, found himself utterly unprepared. His narrow view of the complexities of Germania, combined with his unwavering trust in Arminius, led Rome to its greatest military defeat. Varus' blind trust not only resulted in the destruction of his legions, but also opened a wound at the heart of the Roman Empire, showing that even the most powerful empire in history could be defeated by the betrayal and misjudgment of a single man. The silence of the Teutoburg forest was broken by the distant sound of Roman marches. The legions, in orderly formation, advanced through terrain they could barely recognize, surrounded by dense trees and shadows cast by the faint light of early morning. Varus, as always, believed that their discipline and preparation were invincible. Arminius, on the other hand, knew the moment to execute his strategy was about to materialize. He watched it all from a secret command point, his warriors strategically spread out, waiting for the signal to begin the destruction. The Romans, like a well-tuned clock, marched forward unaware of the threat encircling them. The precision of their steps in the muddy ground and the rigidity of their formations contrasted with the wild nature around them. However, the terrain that seemed peaceful concealed a deadly danger. Arminius had chosen this spot meticulously, knowing that here the Romans would find themselves powerless in the face of disorder and surprise. And that's exactly what happened. The first Germanic offensive did not come with a wild shout or a burst of fury. Instead, it was a stealthy and devastating attack. Arrows were fired from the trees, spears and axes cut through the air, striking the Romans with unusual violence. The Germanic warriors, like shadows in the forest, moved quickly, attacking from different points, giving the Romans no chance to regroup their lines. The element of surprise was total. When the Romans tried to organize themselves in their traditional battle formations, the dense forest and the muddy ground prevented them from holding their lines. The enemy, quick and agile, attacked from all sides, with no respect for Roman conventions of combat. The Germanic auxiliary troops, made up of local warriors trained in guerrilla tactics, blended with the warriors from the tribes, attacking with brutality, knowing the weaknesses of the Roman legions. The battle became a whirlwind of chaos. The short swords of the Germanics quickly pierced the Roman defenses, while the Romans, with no space to move and no rigid formation to make them effective, were disorganized and vulnerable. The Romans tried to react, but the constant pressure and relentless attacks quickly dismantled their lines. Every attempt to form a defense was interrupted by a new, unexpected assault from a different angle. The attack was not only physical, but psychological. The Romans, accustomed to superiority and confidence in their forces, were unprepared for an enemy who did not play by the same rules. The battlefield was no longer an arena of war where Roman discipline could shine, but a labyrinth of trees and darkness where fear spread rapidly. As the attack gained momentum, panic began to spread among the Roman ranks. Men tried to flee, but the trees and swamps made movement difficult. Disorder spread like wildfire, and soon the Roman army was completely at the mercy of the Germanics. Arminius, with a subtle smile on his lips, watched from his strategic point, seeing his trap close in. He knew this was the decisive moment, the fatal blow to the empire he despised. Arminius' surprise attack was not just a military blow, but a lesson in how overconfidence in imperial power can be its own downfall. And as the Romans succumbed to chaos, the Germanic victory seemed inevitable, a turning point in European history, the echoes of which would be felt for centuries. As the battle unfolded, chaos took over the heart of the Roman legions. Men, who had once marched with precision and order, were now scattered across the terrain, desperately fighting for survival. The sound of blades cutting through the air, mixed with cries of pain and despair, echoed through the Teutoburg forest. The Germanic attack was not a simple raid, but a meticulously orchestrated destruction, designed to dismantle the greatest military force of the time. The Roman forces, used to fighting on open fields, had no chance to react properly. The terrain, soaked by constant rain and covered with thick roots and bushes, was a nightmare for the heavy armor and rigid formations of the Romans. Every attempt to regroup was interrupted by a new assault. The sharp and agile Germanic spears cut from all sides, and the Romans, surrounded and with no options, found themselves defeated at every step. The forest, which had seemed like a mere obstacle, was now becoming a prison for the Romans. There was no escape. With every attempt to run for safety, more Germanic guerrillas emerged from the shadows, attacking with deadly precision. The legions, once disciplined and feared throughout the empire, were completely disorganized. Panic spread among the soldiers, and many were killed without even understanding what was happening. Rome's greatest symbol, its military strength, was being brutally crushed. The golden eagles, symbols of honor and prestige, were about to be captured by the Germanics. Each lost standard was a stain on the soul of the empire, a deep blow to Roman identity. For the Romans, the loss of these eagles was much more than a military defeat. It was a humiliation that would burn in the memory of all Roman citizens for generations. Over 3 days of fierce combat, the Romans were hunted like prey. The destruction was relentless. Each legion suffered massive casualties, and even those who tried to flee did not escape. The terrain, now transformed into a muddy battlefield, became a deadly labyrinth, where the bodies of Roman soldiers piled up, mingled with the vegetation, as if the empire itself was being swallowed by the earth. The chaos left no room for dignity. The Roman ranks, once a symbol of discipline and order, were disintegrating in the face of the Germanic fury. It was as though the very invincible spirit of Rome was being shattered by the wildness of nature, by an enemy that did not respect the rules of war Rome had imposed on the world. In the end, when the thunder of battle finally subsided, the field of Teutoburg was covered in a scene of absolute destruction. The bodies of the Romans were scattered, the eagles had been captured, and the survivors, if any, were in a state of total despair. The defeat was evident. Not only had the soldiers been defeated, but the very idea that Rome could conquer any territory without facing fierce resistance had been shattered. The chaos and destruction of Teutoburg not only marked a military tragedy, but also shaped the future of Rome in Europe, defining the empire's borders and forever challenging the invincibility Rome believed it possessed. The impact of this battle would reverberate throughout the empire and beyond, forever altering the perception of Rome and its power. When the battle seemed already lost, the Roman commander Publius Quinctilius Varus found himself in a hopeless position. His troops were being decimated, crushed between the relentless attacks of the Germans and the treacherous terrain of the forest. The disorder that followed the surprise attack left Varus with no options, and soon he realized that his defeat was imminent. In a final attempt to avoid capture and humiliation, Varus, in an act seen as the ultimate fate of a defeated Roman commander, chose death by suicide. This was a common practice among Roman generals. The honor of dying at the enemy's hands was often considered unbearable, and suicide was the way to avoid the suffering and shame of being captured. The moment of his death was a reflection of his complete hopelessness. When Varus finally found himself surrounded by destruction and with no prospect of victory, he withdrew to an isolated place, where he likely took the final act. The death of a Roman commander in such circumstances was laden with symbolism. Varus not only sealed his fate, but also put an end to any hope of an effective response from his troops. When the Germans discovered his body, the humiliation of Rome intensified. Although victory was secured, the capture of Varus and his death under such dramatic circumstances only increased the symbolic value of this defeat. Varus's body was treated with contempt by the Germans, a reflection of the disdain they held for the Romans. He was no longer a victorious Roman commander, but just another victim of the unbeatable force of Germanic resistance. Thus, Varus's death was not just the loss of a commander, but the collapse of an entire line of Roman defense. He represented Rome's failure in its attempt to dominate Germania, a symbol of the fragility of its campaign in northern Europe. When the news of his death reached Rome, it was a devastating blow, not only to the morale of the Romans, but also to the empire itself. The Roman Empire would never be the same after the end of Varus. His defeat was not just a military failure, but the destruction of a dream of infinite expansion. Varus's death became a grim reminder that, no matter how powerful Rome was, there were forces beyond its understanding and control. Its legions were not immune to failure, and the Roman Empire, which once seemed invincible, now faced a defeat that would stain its history forever. Varus's story was not written in glory, but in despair and defeat, and his tragic end became a metaphor for the collapse approaching on Rome's borders. The news of the defeat at Teutoburg spread quickly through Rome, like a destructive fire burning the hope and pride of its people. When Emperor Augustus learned of the catastrophe, his reaction was a mix of shock and rage. According to reports, he was so shaken by the loss of his legions that, in a moment of despair, he banged his head against the palace walls, shouting in frustration, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." Rome, a city that prided itself on its invincibility, now faced a public humiliation that shook its foundations. The Roman legions, symbols of strength and discipline, had been destroyed by an enemy that initially seemed insignificant. The Roman Empire, which had expanded its borders across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, now faced the harsh reality that even its military power was not immune to failure. It was a shame that reverberated in the hearts of all Romans, from the rulers to the plebeians. The defeat at Teutoburg was not just a military loss, it struck at Rome's national pride. The Romans saw their legions as the embodiment of their greatness. The idea that their soldiers, feared and respected throughout the world, could be massacred by Germanic tribes was unthinkable. It was a blow to their identity, to their history of conquests and victories. The defeat was a painful reminder that Rome, no matter how powerful, was still vulnerable. The capture of the eagles of the destroyed legions, symbols of Roman honor, was an additional insult. Each eagle represented the soul of the legion, and its loss meant the fall of the integrity and glory of the Roman armed forces. The Germans, by capturing them, not only defeated the Romans but also ripped away a piece of what the Romans held most dear, their military honor. For Rome, the loss of these eagles was irreparable, a sign that their greatness had been undone in a brutal and humiliating way. Within Rome, the humiliation of Teutoburg manifested in various ways. The Senate, which had always supported the empire's expansions, was now bewildered and concerned about Rome's future. Confidence in the Roman military's capabilities was shaken. The fear of more defeats in foreign lands spread across the city. For the common citizens, who had always viewed Rome as an unbeatable power, the defeat was an affront to their worldview. No longer confident in their invincibility, many began to question Augustus's leadership and the security of the empire. The humiliation was so deep that Rome's very image was shaken. The Romans had seen themselves as the masters of the world, but now they were faced with the harsh reality that they could not control everything, and that their military strength, no matter how powerful, would not protect them forever. Teutoburg not only changed Rome's military outlook, but also altered its perception of itself. They were no longer invincible. The defeat became a turning point, irreversibly changing the trajectory of the empire. For the Romans, the golden eagle was much more than a mere standard. It was the symbol of a legion's soul, the representation of its soldiers' honor and bravery. Each legion had an eagle, and its loss was considered an absolute disaster, a disgrace that would last for generations. Thus, the capture of the Roman eagles by the Germanic tribes was a mortal blow to the empire's morale, something Rome had never imagined facing. When the Roman legions were annihilated in the Teutoburg forest, the fate of these eagles was sealed. Arminius and his Germanic allies, after the battle, took possession of these standards. Rome's humiliation was heightened not only by the death of thousands of soldiers and the failure of its generals, but by the fact that the eagles, sacred symbols of military honor, were now in the hands of an enemy who had once been seen as little more than a group of savages. The capture of the eagles was both a strategic and psychological blow. For the Germans, it was a trophy, a way to show the world they had defeated the greatest military power of the time. For Rome, it was an irreparable loss, a sign that its armies were far from invincible. The loss of the eagles was not just a military disaster, but a symbolic offense to the very Roman identity. The eagles represented the empire, and now they were being dishonored by those whom the Romans considered inferior. The impact of this loss was so great that over the following years, Rome found itself forced to attempt to recover these eagles as a symbol of redemption and reparation. In 14 AD, when the young general Germanicus, the great-nephew of Augustus, began a series of campaigns against the Germans to avenge Teutoburg, one of his main missions was precisely to recover the lost eagles. The search for these eagles became not only a military mission, but a moral one. Rome's honor was at stake, and the eagles were seen as the key to restoring the empire's glory. Despite Germanicus' victories, who managed to recover 2 of the lost eagles, the psychological damage had already been done. The Roman legions, which once felt like an invincible force, now bore the scar of defeat. The stigma of the loss of the eagles was not easily erased. The story of Teutoburg and the capture of the eagles would be passed down from generation to generation as a reminder that even the Roman Empire, the greatest and most powerful in the world, could be defeated. Moreover, the loss of the eagles had a lasting effect on Roman policies. The empire, which had expanded without limits, was now more cautious in its military campaigns, especially in the regions north of the Rhine. The defeat at Teutoburg, along with the loss of the eagles, caused Rome to rethink its strategy of conquest, and from that moment, expansion beyond the Rhine was abandoned. The empire began to adopt a more defensive stance, consolidating its borders rather than seeking new lands to conquer. Thus, the loss of the eagles not only marked the end of Rome's ambition to dominate Germania, but also symbolized the beginning of a new phase for the empire, more aware of its vulnerabilities and the need to protect its honor and borders. After the devastating impact of the defeat at Teutoburg, Rome found itself facing a crisis that shook its deepest foundations. The loss of 3 legions and the disgraceful disappearance of the Roman eagles were not isolated events. They represented a strategic failure and a loss of confidence in the military forces. However, amidst the shock and shame, the Roman war machine, as battered as it was, did not succumb to hopelessness. The first reaction was the somber silence that fell over the city. Emperor Augustus, usually a calculated and unflappable leader, was visibly affected. His ministers and generals, who had been confident in the expansion campaigns, were now faced with a new scenario marked by the need for deep reflection on the empire's vulnerability. But contrary to what many imagined, Rome did not succumb to panic. Instead, a quiet determination began to take shape. Augustus, in his usual prudence, prohibited the rebuilding of the destroyed legions. The destruction of these legions not only meant the loss of troops, but also a psychological blow. For the Romans, the legions were symbols not only of military strength, but also of identity and power. Recreating these combat units would be an attempt to reclaim something that was already lost, the prestige of the armed forces. In this context, Augustus decided to strengthen Roman defenses along the Rhine and Danube, further limiting the empire's expansion. This was a fundamental shift in Roman strategy, which until then had been focused on conquest. Now, the priority was to protect what had already been conquered, and the militarization of the borders became the new line of defense. While the Roman defense gained strength, Rome's foreign policy also began to shift. The Senate, traditionally in favor of large expansions, now adopted a more cautious stance. The voices calling for vengeance, like those of generals who saw the need to retaliate for the humiliation suffered, were tempered by the reality of the loss. The empire needed time to recover, to strengthen its position, and to protect its borders rather than continue advancing without considering the consequences. Although the Roman Empire was in a moment of reevaluation, the response was not a total withdrawal or surrender. On the contrary, Rome's reaction was shaped by the empire's characteristic resilience. They understood that Teutoburg did not mean the end, but rather a painful learning chapter. It was necessary to find a way to restore the lost pride, and that meant a strategic military response, not an indiscriminate war. The initial response, however, was not immediate. Rome needed time to digest the defeat and formulate a new approach. The empire, as it had always done, adapted and began to reformulate its strategy to ensure that something like Teutoburg would never happen again. This also led to a re-evaluation of how generals were chosen. The blind trust in figures like Publius Quintilius Varus, who had been easily deceived by Arminius, was a bitter lesson. The empire needed shrewder leaders, better prepared to face unpredictable enemies. The defensive stance adopted by Rome after the defeat at Teutoburg shaped the following decades. But while the Romans had lost confidence in expansion to the north, the determination to restore their power and honor was never erased. The responses to Teutoburg not only rebuilt the armed forces, but also reinforced the resilience of the Roman nation, which was now preparing to face challenges in a more strategic and cautious manner. The humiliation of Teutoburg was not easily erased from the collective memory of Rome. The losses, both human and symbolic, left a deep mark on the empire's morale. However, amid this mourning, a figure emerged who would soon stand out as the answer to the shame of Teutoburg. Germanicus, the great-nephew of Augustus, and a commander with the determination and fervor necessary to restore Rome's honor. Germanicus was not only an heir to the imperial bloodline, he possessed an impressive military talent. His ability to lead troops and his personal courage were widely recognized, and this earned him the monumental task of avenging the defeat at Teutoburg and, more importantly, restoring Roman supremacy. In 14 AD, with the support of a considerable military force, Germanicus marched north, determined to bring to Rome the revenge it deserved. His first mission was clear: recover the lost eagles. These eagles, which had been captured by the Germans during the battle, were not only a symbol of honor for Rome, but also a vital element for the empire to reclaim its glory. Germanicus knew that if he could recover these sacred relics, he would not only restore Roman honor, but also strengthen the empire's position in future negotiations with the Germanic peoples. Germanicus' path was arduous and full of challenges. He faced well-organized Germanic tribes familiar with the terrain, who moved easily through the dense forests and swamps. Even so, Germanicus showed his skill by inflicting significant defeats on the Germanic tribes, forcing many of them to surrender or retreat inland. His ability to adapt Roman tactics to the hostile terrain of Germania was crucial to the success of his campaigns. But Germanicus' greatest victory was recovering 2 of the lost eagles, an achievement of great symbolism and importance. When he managed to recover these eagles, the empire saw it as a partial reparation for the shame of Teutoburg. The Roman legions, which had been marked by the loss, could now look at the recovery of these eagles as a sign that Rome could still be victorious. However, Germanicus' campaign was not limited to recovering the eagles. He also inflicted heavy losses on the Germans, destroying villages and forcing the tribes to submit to Rome's power. His military action was forceful and effective, restoring confidence in the Roman forces. The Germanic tribes that had allied with Arminius soon realized that Rome's strength was still alive and willing to punish any threat to its authority. However, what Germanicus couldn't control was the internal politics of Rome. Despite his victories, the empire was divided on how to deal with Germania. Some saw Germanicus' campaigns as an opportunity to reverse the defeat of Teutoburg and establish a new balance of power, while others, more cautious, believed Germania should be left in peace, given the clear difficulties of conquering and maintaining the territory. Germanicus, however, didn't let Rome's political uncertainties bring him down. He continued his expeditions with vigor, but he knew his success wasn't guaranteed. He had avenged the defeat at Teutoburg, and, by recovering the lost eagles, had partially restored the empire's honor. However, Germania remained a harsh territory for Rome, and the future of the campaigns remained uncertain. The impact of his expeditions, however, was undeniable. He had proven that Rome would not be easily defeated, and that the spirit of vengeance that had followed the defeat of Teutoburg would continue to drive the empire. After Germanicus' temporary victories and the partial restoration of Rome's honor, the deeper question still loomed over the empire. Was Germania truly conquerable? The answer to this question began to become clear in the campaigns that followed. Despite Germanicus' military victories, the terrain of Germania continued to be a colossal challenge for the Romans. The dense forests, treacherous swamps, steep mountains, and humid climate made any Roman advance a long and costly process. The Roman legions, accustomed to more predictable battlefields and more easily controlled lands, now found themselves immersed in a wild and hostile environment. In addition to the natural difficulties, there was also the unpredictable behavior of the Germanic tribes. Although many of the Germanic peoples had been defeated or forced to retreat, resistance had not dissipated. Arminius, the traitor leader who had caused the catastrophe of Teutoburg, was still active, leading a guerrilla war that made the most of his intimate knowledge of the terrain. He continued to unite various tribes under his banner, creating an impenetrable resistance network that tested the patience and resources of the Romans. Rome, a power accustomed to domination through its military force and infrastructure, was beginning to realize that the decentralized guerrilla nature of the Germanic tribes made any attempt at stable occupation incredibly difficult. Unlike regions like Gaul, which were structured and susceptible to Roman imperial organization, Germania was a land of independent tribes, without organized cities or centers of power that could be easily conquered and governed. Additionally, Roman logistics were proving to be limited. The long distances, rugged terrain, and lack of reliable supply routes made transporting supplies and reinforcements difficult. The legions, always efficient in plains or more organized regions, were constantly worn down by geography and ambushes, which had become a common tactic among the Germanics. The local resistance also proved resilient. Every Roman victory was often followed by a series of retaliatory attacks that wore down the morale of the troops. The Germanic tribes, for their part, were willing to fight for their land, using guerrilla tactics perfectly adapted to the treacherous terrain. One Roman commander after another began to realize that Germania was not a territory that could be easily subdued. The resistance was not only military, but also cultural and political. The Germanic tribes had a deep connection to their lands and traditions, making any attempt at domination an even greater challenge. While Rome was able to inflict damage on the tribes and restore order in some areas, the prospect of total conquest of Germania was increasingly looking out of reach. Continuing the military campaigns was proving too costly in terms of lives, resources, and time, with no guarantees that the territory could be maintained under control. Rome was at a crossroads. The conquest of Germania was possible, but it would likely not be worth the price that would have to be paid. Over time, the campaigns became less aggressive. Rome began to realize that the occupation of Germania was not viable in the long term. The idea of expanding its domains to northern Europe was gradually abandoned as the empire chose to strengthen its borders along the Rhine and Danube, where defense was more accessible and less costly. The impossibility of conquering Germania became a political and military reality that shaped the future of the empire. From that point on, Rome consolidated its defenses and adopted a more defensive posture, recognizing that there were limits to its expansion and that there were territories that simply weren't worth the cost of conquest. This decision reflected a strategic shift that would have lasting implications for the Roman Empire. While Rome continued to be a dominant military power, it now focused on maintaining what it had already conquered and protecting its borders rather than seeking endless expansion. This defensive posture began to define Rome's new reality in the years to come, and the empire would never again seek to conquer Germania, accepting the natural boundary formed by the Rhine and Danube rivers. As Rome increasingly accepted that Germania was beyond its direct control, Arminius became an even more central figure in the fight for independence for the Germanic tribes. He, who had already delivered the greatest blow to the Roman Empire by orchestrating the ambush at the Battle of Teutoburg, continued to lead his resistance with impressive strategic skill. His position, now consolidated among the tribes, was not just that of a military leader, but also a symbol of resistance, unity, and the fight for freedom. Arminius, who had once been an ally and even a friend of the Romans, felt the need to repay what he saw as betrayal: Rome's attempt to subjugate and conquer the Germanic peoples. In his mind, Roman domination over the region was not just a military matter, but an affront to the freedom of the Germanic tribes and their culture. His goal now was clear. It wasn't just about preventing Roman occupation, but about driving the Romans out of Germania once and for all. With his cunning and intimate knowledge of the land, Arminius became a constant nightmare for the Romans. He rallied tribes of different origins and ethnicities, many of which had previously been in conflict with each other, uniting them in a fragile but effective alliance against the invader. Arminius exploited the disunity of the Roman forces, who, despite being powerful in open battle, were vulnerable when it came to surprise attacks and fighting in unfamiliar terrain. Arminius' guerrilla tactics, developed in his youth within his people, were extremely effective against the Roman legions. Ambushes, quick strikes, and the use of dense forests and swamps as natural weapons to disorient and delay the Romans kept the Roman Empire constantly on edge, forcing them to make costly incursions with no guarantees of success. Even in the face of his early victories, Arminius knew that the real battle would be for the morale of his people. The resistance, though fierce, needed to be fueled by the idea of a common cause. He was more than a military commander. He was a symbol of struggle, hope, and resistance for all those who opposed the Roman presence in their lands. However, Arminius' success would not be easy to maintain. The Germanic tribes, although united against a common enemy, had long-standing rivalries and their own interests. Each tribe brought different expectations and goals to the table, and the unity Arminius had carefully forged was beginning to show signs of strain. Some tribal leaders began to question Arminius' choices, feeling that their own tribes were being sacrificed in favor of an endless war. Despite this, Arminius remained steadfast in his mission. He knew that even a temporary victory over Rome could inspire his allies and unite the tribes even further. His figure became a symbol of resistance across Germania, and his name echoed as a cry for freedom for those who saw themselves as oppressed. However, his journey was far from smooth. The forces of Rome, although unable to permanently conquer Germania, never ceased to pursue and attempt to dismantle Arminius' resistance, sending expeditions and reinforcements after each failure. The war between Rome and the Germanic tribes turned into a relentless struggle where victory and defeat were constantly redefined. Arminius, aware of the difficulties he faced, never abandoned the idea that his land should be free from Roman influence, and this conviction kept him in leadership, guiding his people with tireless determination. The news of the defeat at Teutoburg shook Rome in a way that few events in the empire's history could. The unwavering confidence that the Romans had in their invincibility was brutally shattered. For centuries, Rome had been seen as an incomparable power, capable of conquering and subjugating the greatest empires and peoples of the known world. But now, in the face of the loss of 3 legions and the public humiliation, the fragility of the empire, no matter how strong, was exposed. Emperor Augustus, who had always been calculating and precise in his actions, showed a more human and vulnerable side when he heard the news of the tragedy. The pain of losing more than 15,000 men, including some of Rome's best soldiers, was indescribable. But the loss of the eagles, the sacred standards that symbolized the honor and power of Rome, was the most devastating blow. The golden eagle was not only a symbol of military power, but a reflection of Roman identity. Losing those relics meant more than a military defeat. It was an affront to the very spirit of Rome. Roman psychology, which had long believed in its invincibility, collapsed. In the corridors of power, there was no longer talk of expansions, but of protection and defense. The empire, which for centuries had believed it could extend its borders to the ends of the earth, now found itself forced to reconsider its ambitions. The defeat in the Teutoburg forest was not just a military stain, but a humiliation that would echo for generations. But the psychological impact wasn't limited to the circles of power. On the streets of Rome, among common citizens, there was a sense of shock and disbelief. Many Romans had friends and family among the lost legions. The idea that the unbeatable Roman soldiers had been annihilated by a people considered barbarians was hard to accept. Roman pride was wounded, and rumors began to spread, mixing facts and speculation. Some said that the Romans had been victims of Germanic magic, others that the gods had abandoned Rome. For the soldiers who survived the tragedy, the weight of defeat was equally unbearable. They had been defeated not in open battle, where they could fight according to their tactics, but in a clever ambush that exploited the weaknesses of their formation. This generated a sense of shame among many. For the Romans, being captured or killed in battle was one thing. Being ambushed and massacred was something else, more humiliating. In Rome, the very concept of honor was redefined after Teutoburg. Many began to question the notion of invincibility that had always defined Roman identity. The psychological impact of the defeat not only affected the army's morale, but also influenced Roman politics and strategy. From now on, any expansionist move would be treated with more caution, and Roman confidence in quick and overwhelming victories would be carefully reconsidered. The defeat at Teutoburg also left a deep scar on the way Rome dealt with its provinces. Rome's confidence in ruling with an iron fist diminished, and the difficulties in maintaining control over Germania became a constant reminder that, no matter how powerful, Rome had its vulnerabilities. The empire would never again dare to dream of expansion beyond the Rhine, and the fear of the unknown, and the invisible enemy became a shadow over Roman conquest plans. Teutoburg, more than just a battle, was a collective trauma that altered the course of Roman history and left an indelible mark on the empire's destiny. After the devastating psychological impact of Teutoburg, Rome was forced to reassess its expansionist ambitions. The empire, which had once seemed unbeatable and determined to expand its borders to the maximum, now found itself in a defensive position. The loss of the legions, the destruction of the eagles, and the public humiliation imposed an inevitable strategic shift. The Roman Empire, which had been driven by an incessant pursuit of more territories, was forced to turn toward the preservation of its own integrity and security. Emperor Augustus, now aged and cautious after the disaster, responded with a series of defensive measures. His posture toward Germania and other frontier regions changed drastically. From then on, the idea of continuous expansion gave way to a more prudent and strategic approach: the protection of the empire's borders. Rome focused on consolidating power in already conquered territories, such as Gaul and Hispania, and strengthening its defenses along the Rhine and Danube. The goal was no longer to expand, but to maintain what had already been conquered. In Rome, there was a growing consensus that the cost of conquering new territories no longer justified the rewards. The human and material costs of military campaigns, like those experienced at Teutoburg, began to be viewed more realistically. War was no longer just a matter of prestige, but a struggle for the survival of the empire itself. Moreover, the fierce resistance of the Germanic peoples and the challenging geography of the region, with its dense forests and uneven terrain, made any attempt to conquer Germania extremely risky and expensive. The shift in Roman policy was not only military, but also administrative and social. The Senate, which had been a powerful force during the Republican period, now became more aligned with the will of the emperor, who was more cautious and focused on avoiding further catastrophes. Military expeditions, once seen as forms of glory and conquest, began to be treated with greater caution. Rome adopted a defensive stance, prioritizing the security of its borders and the maintenance of internal order. Augustus also focused on strengthening ties with the people of the provinces, seeking to ensure the loyalty of their governors and military forces. Rome understood that the preservation of the empire depended not only on its legions, but also on the ability to maintain political and economic stability in the regions already dominated. The focus was on consolidating power and preventing the rise of new revolts or rebellions that could threaten the empire's integrity. This new strategic approach was essential for Rome's survival in the following years. The attempt to expand into Germania was abandoned, and the empire focused its efforts on ensuring internal stability. Over the following decades, Rome consolidated itself as a defensive power, adjusting to the new balance of power in the ancient world, where borders were already established and external threats were increasingly complex. Teutoburg, with its bitter lesson, permanently altered the course of Roman history. The empire, which had once seemed unbeatable, now found itself challenged to reconsider its limits and redirect its strategies. The shift in Roman policy after the defeat was not only a reaction to the tragedy, but a sign that Rome had matured in its understanding of the world and its own limits. This strategic transformation shaped the future of the Roman Empire and led it into an era of relative peace and stability along its borders, though always with the shadow of the Teutoburg disaster looming over its decisions. After the resounding victory over the Roman legions at Teutoburg, Arminius became a hero among the Germanic tribes. He was celebrated as the leader who challenged the Roman Empire and defeated its most formidable army. However, Arminius' glory would not last forever. His victory, which should have solidified him as a unifying figure for the Germanic peoples, began to generate internal divisions that he could neither foresee nor control. Though he had gathered a coalition of tribes to fight against Rome, Arminius soon found himself in conflict with other Germanic leaders. Tribes that had initially allied with him began to question his leadership, fearing his growing power might threaten their own autonomy. Arminius was not only a military commander, he was also seen by some as an emerging monarch, which led to distrust among those who had always valued tribal independence. The situation was further complicated by the increasing pressure from the Roman-aligned tribes still resisting domination, such as the Cherusci led by Segestes, a rival leader of Arminius. Segestes, who had been a declared enemy of Arminius, not only survived the defeat at Teutoburg, but also began plotting against him, seeking to undermine his power. The desire of some tribes to restore their relations with Rome and ensure a degree of political stability led to Arminius' growing isolation, and he could no longer count on the same allies as before. Moreover, Arminius' figure was becoming increasingly polarizing. For some, he was still the leader who had defeated the Romans and ensured the freedom of the Germanic tribes, but for others, he was becoming a threat to local independence. His attempt to consolidate centralized power over the Germanic tribes clashed with the traditional decentralized system of local cultures, where each tribe maintained its own identity and autonomy. However, the greatest threat to Arminius came from within the Germanic tribes themselves. His former allies began turning against him, and a conspiracy was formed to remove him from power. In 21 AD, Arminius was assassinated by his own countrymen, among whom was his wife, Themelichus, the daughter of Segestes. Arminius' death was a devastating blow for the Germanic people, who had placed so much hope in him. His assassination marked the end of a unified resistance against Rome that for a time had seemed sustainable. Arminius' decline was not only the end of his life, but also the end of an era of unified resistance against the Roman Empire. His death brought a sense of uncertainty among the Germanic tribes, who lost a strong and charismatic leader. The momentum he had given to the resistance gradually dissipated, and the tribes once again fragmented into their own internal conflicts. However, Arminius' legacy continued to be remembered, as he had shown that Rome, despite its impressive military strength, was not invincible. His death, though tragic for the Germanic tribes, also marked a turning point in the region's history. The Roman Empire, though it did not conquer Germania, failed to completely eliminate the resistance. Even without Arminius, the Germanic tribes continued to fight Rome, but the unity he had provided was lost, making it more difficult for any lasting mobilization against the empire. Thus, Arminius' decline not only affected the Germanic tribes, but also reaffirmed a fundamental truth. The fragmented and decentralized nature of the Germanic tribes would make any attempt at prolonged resistance against Roman power difficult. The figure of Arminius, now mythicized, would become a symbol of resistance, but his death showed that even the greatest heroes face the limits of ambition and internal divisions. The Battle of Teutoburg left an indelible mark on history. The crushing defeat of the Roman legions not only reconfigured the future of Germania, but also deeply impacted ancient Rome, which would need to reconsider its expansionist ambitions. For the Germanic peoples, the victory was a milestone that sealed the birth of a collective identity, a consciousness that together they could resist the might of such a great and powerful empire. They were no longer at the mercy of Rome, and the victory at Teutoburg came to be seen as the moment when Germania, for the first time, successfully defended its independence. The psychological impact for Rome was devastating. The defeat at Teutoburg was not only a matter of military losses, but also a deep blow to the arrogance of the Roman Empire. Until that point, Rome had seen itself as invincible, capable of subjugating any territory that stood in its way. Teutoburg challenged this view, showing that even the greatest military power of the time could be defeated. The symbol of the eagles, which represented the pride and identity of the legions, was captured, amplifying the weight of the humiliation. But beyond the immediate humiliation, the Battle of Teutoburg had long-term political repercussions. Rome, under Augustus' command, was forced to rethink its expansionist policy. The focus of imperial administration shifted to the defense of borders rather than new conquests. The policy of aggressive military expansion was replaced with a more defensive posture, with the construction of forts and fortifications along the Rhine and Danube rivers, aimed at protecting the Roman Empire from external threats. Hadrian's Wall, for example, reflects this new defensive mindset, a testament to the fact that expansion to the east, towards Germania, was no longer feasible. In Germania, the battle also had a lasting effect. Arminius became a mythical figure, a symbol of successful resistance against the Roman invader. His leadership not only inspired the Germanic tribes at the time, but also created a kind of legend about the unification and strength of the native peoples against the empire. Even after his tragic death, Arminius' name continued to be remembered, not only as the leader who had defeated the Romans, but as the hero who challenged the established order. Moreover, the victory at Teutoburg had a lasting impact on how the Romans viewed Germania. Although the Romans continued to make some incursions, such as Germanicus expeditions, the desire to completely conquer Germania was abandoned. Instead, the region was seen as an impassable territory, filled with natural dangers and warrior tribes, and the Roman attempt to control it was replaced by a more pragmatic recognition of the empire's limitations. The legacy of Teutoburg also resonated through the centuries, far beyond ancient Rome. The struggle between the Romans and the Germanic tribes shaped European history, marking one of the foundational moments that separated the Roman world from the Germanic world. The tribes that resisted the Roman invasion, led by figures like Arminius, helped pave the way for the emergence of new nations and empires in the future. Ultimately, the Battle of Teutoburg was not just a military defeat, but a battle that played a crucial role in shaping national identities and the political and cultural divisions that would define Europe in the centuries to come. It showed that, while Rome was powerful, the power of a culture deeply rooted in its land and history could indeed challenge the supremacy of the empire. And it was this resistance, exemplified by Arminius and the Germanic tribes, that helped forge the identity of medieval Europe, a Europe that would eventually separate itself from imperial Rome and follow its own path. Though the defeat at Teutoburg was a devastating military event for Rome, its long-term consequences reverberated far beyond the borders of the Roman Empire. The battle and its implications profoundly shaped the course of European history, impacting the balance of power in the region for centuries. First, the Battle of Teutoburg marked the end of Roman ambitions to fully conquer Germania. Before this, Rome envisioned expanding its borders beyond the Rhine, annexing Germanic lands, and consolidating its dominance over the entire region. However, the defeat in the Teutoburg forests forced the Romans to reconsider their strategies and, more importantly, to recognize the limits of their expansion. Germania, with its dense forests and treacherous terrain, became a natural barrier for the empire, a reminder that even Rome's military power could not subdue the entire region. In geopolitical terms, this led to a redirection of Roman forces to other parts of the empire, with the main concern being the consolidation of control over already conquered provinces. The focus shifted to defending the borders along the Rhine and the Danube, marking the end of an era of territorial expansion. This new defensive focus resulted in the construction of a series of fortifications along the Roman frontiers, including the famous Hadrian's Wall in Britannia, and later, the Antonine Wall, which helped protect the Roman Empire from barbarian invasions. In Germania, the victory over Rome had lasting implications for the formation of a collective Germanic identity. The Germanic tribes that had united under the leadership of Arminius experienced a cultural and political renaissance. Although the tribes remained decentralized and largely independent, the victory over Rome helped solidify a spirit of unity among them, causing them to resist even more firmly any attempt at foreign domination. The myth of Arminius, the leader who defeated Rome, became central in the historical narrative and the construction of a Germanic national identity, despite internal divisions. In the long run, Germania did not immediately become a unified nation, but the seeds of a common Germanic identity had been planted. In the centuries that followed, these tribes continued to organize, form alliances, and resist external pressure, with many of their actions contributing to the formation of the medieval Germanic kingdoms. The Battle of Teutoburg, therefore, served as a crucial turning point that helped define the future trajectory of the region, culminating in the formation of powerful Germanic states during the medieval period and later, modern Germany. For Rome, the consequences were also profound. Teutoburg not only affected the morale of the Roman legions, but also altered imperial policy regarding warfare. The defeat highlighted the vulnerability of the Roman Empire, showing that even its military machinery could fail against enemies who used unconventional tactics and knew their territory well. From then on, Rome became more cautious when facing barbarian tribes in unfamiliar regions, adopting a more cautious and defensive posture. Furthermore, the battle helped redefine the relationship between Rome and its Germanic allies. While some Germanic leaders turned against Rome, others continued to serve as auxiliaries in the Roman forces, but now with more distrust and a renewed sense of independence. This scenario would be one of the elements that helped shape Roman policy regarding relations with peoples outside its borders. Finally, the Battle of Teutoburg had a significant impact on the history of Europe as a whole. The dividing line established between the Roman world and the Germanic world helped forge the development of European cultures and identities. Centuries later, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Germanic nations would be key in the creation of medieval Europe, with the Germanic kingdoms taking the place of the ancient empire. The Germanic peoples, who once resisted Roman expansion, would become the successors of ancient Rome, giving rise to new powers and nations on the European continent. Thus, the consequences of Teutoburg were profound and long-lasting, extending far beyond the battlefield. They helped establish the foundations for the future of the Germanic lands and shaped the politics and history of Europe for centuries. The battle was a watershed moment that not only marked the end of Roman ambitions in Germania, but also triggered a new chapter in the formation of identities and nations that would define the continent in the future. The Battle of Teutoburg, though an immediate disaster for Rome, ultimately became one of the most decisive and formative moments in the history of Europe and the Roman Empire. It not only challenged the idea of an invincible Rome, but also irreversibly changed imperial politics and the fate of vast regions of Europe. Reflecting on the impact of this defeat is to look at the heart of Roman ambition, its relentless pursuit of expansion, and the limits of that pursuit in the face of the forces of nature, culture, and local resistance. Rome, with all its military power, sophisticated engineering, and well-trained legions, was forced to recognize that victory did not depend solely on brute strength. In Teutoburg, the terrain, climate, and resistance of the Germanic tribes showed that even the greatest war machine of antiquity could be defeated. The lesson there was clear. The subjugation of lands beyond the Rhine would not be conquered as easily as other pacified provinces. The defeat also served as a warning about the dangers of blind trust. Publius Quinctilius Varus, the Roman commander, underestimated the Germans and trusted an ally who was, in fact, plotting his downfall. This not only cost the life of Varus and his legions, but also left an indelible mark on Rome's military history. The battle demonstrated that strategy and knowledge of the terrain could, in many situations, be more important than pure military strength, especially when the resistance was deeply rooted in local culture. From the perspective of Arminius and the Germanic tribes, Teutoburg represented more than just a military victory. It was a cultural triumph and an act of affirmation of identity. For the Germans, defeating Rome was proof of their strength and resilience, a reminder that despite attempts to conquer their territories, their independence and freedom were, in some way, preserved. And although the battle did not permanently unite the Germanic tribes, it provided a symbolic foundation that would later be cultivated in the creation of a collective Germanic identity. The myth of Arminius, the hero who defeated Rome, would continue to be told for generations, fueling the spirit of resistance and pride in the Germanic lands. But for Rome, Teutoburg was not just a military defeat. It was also a turning point that redefined how the empire looked at its borders and expansionist policies. Instead of looking to the future as a continuation of conquests, Rome now had to adopt a more defensive posture, recognizing that it could not control all the lands it desired. This reflection brought a fundamental shift in the way Rome positioned itself, both inside and outside its borders. The long shadow of Teutoburg would extend for centuries, not only affecting Rome's decisions, but also helping shape the destiny of Europe. The defeat weakened the Roman expansionist drive, allowing the Germanic tribes to follow their independent development path, eventually giving rise to the nations that would dominate medieval Europe. And the very history of the battle became a milestone in the formation of Germanic identity, with its memories being passed down from generation to generation. Ultimately, the Battle of Teutoburg is more than just a simple military defeat. It is a reminder that even the most powerful empires, with all their strength and resources, can be challenged by factors beyond imagination and the capacity for adaptation. It teaches us about the limits of ambition, the complexity of human relations, and the power of culture and resistance. The story of Teutoburg, with all its implications, remains a timeless lesson that, in the game of civilizations, even giants can fall, and the winds of history can change in unexpected and dramatic ways. And so we come to the end of this incredible journey through the history of Rome and the Battle of Teutoburg, a defeat that changed the course of the Roman Empire and left an indelible mark on European history. But what do you think? How did the battle shape the future of Rome and the Germanic tribes? Leave your comment below, share your opinions and reflections. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up to show your support and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any details of our upcoming historical adventures. Hit the bell to receive notifications and stay updated on everything we're preparing for you. See you in the next video, with more fascinating stories and moments that shaped the course of history. Until then,